3 days before my wedding, a woman I had never met in my life grabbed my wrist outside a coffee shop and said, "Don't marry him until you ask him about the girl in the lake." Then she let go of my wrist, pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm, and walked away so fast that by the time I looked up, she was already gone, swallowed into the crowd like she had never existed at all. I stood there on the sidewalk holding a stranger's warning, my coffee going cold in my other hand, and I remember thinking one very specific thought before anything else. I thought, I don't know anyone who lives near a lake. That's the first thing that should have scared me. It didn't, not yet. What scared me was what happened when I finally opened the paper, alone, in my car, with the engine off and my hands strangely steady. There was no letter inside, just a single name, written in small, careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who has written that name 1,000 times before and still can't write it without pressing too hard on the pen. Sophie. I had never heard that name in my life. Not from my fiancé, I'll call him Ethan, not from his family, not from a single one of his friends in the 3 years we'd been together. Not once. In 3 years of birthdays and holidays and long, lazy Sunday mornings where you tell each other everything just to fill the silence. And yet somehow, a stranger on a sidewalk had just handed me a name 3 days before my wedding, like it was supposed to mean something, like she expected it to detonate quietly inside me the second I read it. I didn't tell Ethan that night. I want you to remember that decision, because it matters later, more than I understood at the time. Instead, I did what anyone with a laptop and a bad feeling does at 11 o'clock at night, sitting cross-legged on the bathroom floor so the light wouldn't wake him. I searched the name Sophie alongside his name, expecting nothing, genuinely expecting absolutely nothing, already rehearsing the story I'd tell myself about how this was all a strange coincidence. I got one result. A single local news article, 6 years old, 3 sentences long, easy to miss if you weren't already looking for it. The kind of article that gets buried under 1,000 newer headlines within a week of running. A woman named Sophie Reyes, age 26, was reported missing after a group camping trip at Miller's Lake. Her body was recovered 4 days later. The death was ruled accidental drowning. I read that sentence 4 times before I let myself connect it to anything, before I let myself even consider what it might mean. Because there, in the very last line of the article, buried in a short list of names of people who had been on that camping trip, names listed the way local papers list them, almost as an afterthought, was Ethan's name. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a long time, longer than I want to admit, listening to the pipes settle in the walls of an apartment that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone I didn't fully know. And then, because some part of me needed to know I wasn't losing my mind, I did the only thing that felt like it made sense. I called the one person who had known Ethan the longest, his best man. A man named Grant, who I'd always liked, who told great stories at dinner parties, who made everyone laugh within the first 5 minutes of meeting him, who was supposed to stand next to my husband in 72 hours and hand him a ring. I asked him, as casually as I could manage with my voice shaking, if he remembered a woman named Sophie. There was a silence on the line that told me everything before he said a single word. A silence with weight to it. A silence I could feel through the phone like a held breath. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. Not, "What did you hear?" Where? That question should have been the second thing that scared me. It wasn't yet. The third thing was what happened after I hung up, when I realized my hands were shaking too hard to hold my phone steady, and I had to set it down on the counter just to stop it from tapping against the granite. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Ethan, listening to him breathe, steady and unaware, staring at the ceiling and running the timeline in my head over and over until the numbers stopped making sense. 3 years together. 0 mentions of a lake, a camping trip, a woman named Sophie, a death investigated as accidental. Not once. Not drunk at a party, not during a fight, not during any of the hundreds of ordinary conversations 2 people have when they're building a life together. The ones where secrets usually slip out sideways without anyone meaning them to. You don't forget to mention that someone died on a trip you were on, unless you're trying very hard not to remember it yourself, and trying just as hard to make sure nobody else ever asks you to. The next morning, I did something I am not proud of, and I want to tell you anyway, because I think you need to understand exactly how far I was willing to go before I ever said a word to him out loud. I went through his phone while he was in the shower, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it through the bathroom door. I found nothing under her name. Of course I found nothing. 6 years is a long time to erase someone properly, and I was starting to understand that Ethan had had a lot of practice. What I found instead was a single calendar entry, recurring every year on the same date, labeled only with 3 letters, M.L. Miller's Lake. 6 years of the same quiet reminder, appearing every single year on the anniversary of a death I hadn't known existed until a stranger grabbed my wrist on a sidewalk 2 days earlier. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. I want you to notice that pattern, because it's the second time in this story I did exactly that. Found something I wasn't supposed to see and quietly put it back and said nothing, because some part of me understood that the moment I asked the real question out loud, there would be no undoing it, no version of my life that went back to how it looked 24 hours earlier. That afternoon, the stranger found me again. She was waiting outside my office this time, sitting on a bench like she had nowhere else in the world to be, watching the door the way you watch something you've been waiting years to see walk through it. Older than me, maybe 50, with a face that looked like it had spent 6 years being tired in a very specific way, a tiredness that lives behind the eyes long after the rest of the face has learned to arrange itself normally for strangers. "You looked her up," she said, not a question. I asked her who she was. "My name is Carol," she said. "Sophie was my daughter." I felt the ground under that sentence the way you feel ground shift right before an earthquake actually starts. That half second where your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. She told me she'd been trying to reach Ethan for 6 years. Letters he never answered, calls he never returned, ringing out again and again until she finally stopped expecting anyone to pick up. A wedding announcement she'd seen online 3 weeks earlier that had finally pushed her to do something she'd sworn she would never do. Approach the woman about to marry the man she believed was responsible for her daughter's death. I asked her, as steadily as I could manage, if she believed Ethan had killed her daughter. And here is where the story took its first real turn, the one I did not see coming, even after everything I'd already pieced together on my own. Carol shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't think Ethan touched her. I think Ethan watched something happen and has spent 6 years too afraid to say what he actually saw." That single sentence rearranged everything I thought I understood about what I was walking into. Everything I'd spent the last 2 days quietly, carefully assembling in my head. Because if Ethan wasn't the danger, then someone else was. And I already had a very good guess about who that someone else might be. A guess I didn't want to say out loud, even to myself yet. Carol told me what the official report never fully explained. 4 people had been on that camping trip: Ethan, Sophie, Grant, and a 4th person, a friend of Grant's who nobody had ever fully accounted for in any interview. Someone Carol had spent 6 years trying and failing to identify, because every time she got close, doors quietly closed in front of her, phone calls stopped being returned, and the trail simply went cold in a way that felt less like bad luck and more like design. She told me Sophie had called her the night before she died, scared, asking her mother to come pick her up early from the trip. Carol never got the chance. By the time she arrived at the lake the next afternoon, her daughter was already missing, and the search had already begun without her. I asked Carol the only question that mattered by that point. I asked her why. If she suspected something, the case had been closed as an accident. She said the same 3 words that had haunted her for 6 years. 3 words she said like she'd worn them smooth from repeating them so many times. No hard evidence. That night, I confronted Ethan. Not with anger, not yet. With a single flat statement, the same way you set a trap and wait to see what walks into it. I told him I knew about Sophie. I watched every ounce of color leave his face, watched his hand freeze halfway to the glass of water on the counter. "Who told you?" he said. "Not what happened. Who told you?" The exact same reflex Grant had shown on the phone 2 days earlier. And I want you to notice that pattern too, because by now it should be setting off alarms in your head the same way it was setting them off in mine. He told me the official version first, the version that matched the newspaper article almost word for word, recited almost too smoothly for someone claiming he never talked about it. A camping trip, a late-night swim nobody should have taken, a tragic accident nobody could have prevented. I asked him why, in 3 years together, he had never once mentioned a woman drowning on a trip he was present for. He said he'd spent 6 years trying to forget it ever happened, and that most days he almost believed he had. I told him about the calendar entry, ML. Every year, on the same date. His face changed again, and this time it wasn't fear. It was something closer to shame, the kind that sits heavier than fear because it doesn't come with an exit. I go to the lake every year, he said quietly. I don't tell anyone. I just go, and I sit there, and I try to figure out if there was anything I could have done differently. I asked him the question I had been building towards since the sidewalk, since the newspaper article, since Carol's bench outside my office. Ethan, what actually happened that night? And this is where the second major turn of the story arrives, the one that changes not just what I believed, but who I believed it about. Ethan told me that on the last night of the trip, Sophie had gotten into an argument with Grant. Not a small one. He said he'd woken up to raised voices outside the tents. Grant's voice, low and furious. Sophie's voice, sharp and frightened, in a way he'd never heard from her before. A tone that had apparently stayed lodged in his memory for 6 full years. He said by the time he got out of his tent, Sophie was already walking toward the water alone, and Grant was standing very still, watching her go, saying nothing at all, just watching. He said he called after her once. She didn't turn around. He assumed the way you assume things at 2 a.m. when you're half asleep and don't yet know what you're witnessing, that she just needed air, that she'd be back in a few minutes, that morning would arrive and everything would be ordinary again. She never came back. I asked him why none of this was in the official report. He said Grant had told him, that same night, before anyone else was awake, exactly what to say if anyone ever asked. A late-night swim. Nobody saw anything unusual. A tragic accident. He said Grant had been his best friend since they were 14 years old. He said in the panic and grief of that first week, agreeing to Grant's version of events had felt, somehow, like the only way to survive it. The only way to keep from losing 2 people instead of 1. He said every year since, the guilt of that decision had gotten heavier instead of lighter, until it had become the one thing he genuinely could not make himself say out loud to anyone, including me, including himself most days. I asked him the only question left. I asked if he thought Grant had done something to her. He said he didn't know. He said that not knowing, 6 years later, was the exact thing that had been quietly destroying him the entire time I'd known him, the thing sitting underneath every quiet mood I'd never fully understood. I want to tell you that I made a clean decision in that moment, but the truth is messier than that. I sat across from a man I loved 3 days before I was supposed to marry him, and I understood, all at once, that the real danger in the story had never been him. It was standing 3 days away from being his best man, smiling in photos, picking out a toast, waiting to stand beside him at an altar. I called Carol that night and told her everything Ethan had just told me. For the first time since I'd met her, I heard her voice break completely, the sound of 6 years finally cracking open at once. She told me something then that reframed the entire story one final time, the piece that had been missing from every version I'd been given up to that point. She said Sophie had confided in her, weeks before that trip, that she was trying to end things with Grant. Not a breakup from a public relationship, a secret one. Something Grant had insisted on keeping hidden from everyone, including Ethan, his own best friend, for reasons Sophie herself had never fully understood. Sophie had told her mother she was frightened of how Grant reacted when she brought it up, frightened enough that she'd almost canceled the camping trip entirely, and had only gone because Grant convinced her it would look strange if she suddenly backed out. Carol had never told anyone this, not the police, not a single soul in 6 years, because she had no proof, only a phone call from a daughter who never made it home to explain the rest. 2 days before my wedding, I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I called off the ceremony, not the relationship, the ceremony. And I told Ethan the 2 of us were going to the police together, with everything, Carol's account and his own, whatever it cost either of us, whatever it meant for the life we'd planned to start that weekend. Grant found out within hours. I don't know exactly how. What I know is that he showed up at our apartment that same night, calm at first, then increasingly not, insisting Ethan didn't actually remember what he thought he remembered, that grief plays tricks on memory, that after everything, after 14 years of friendship, Ethan owed him the benefit of the doubt one more time, one last time, for old time's sake. I watched Ethan, for the first time in 3 years, choose not to give it to him. The investigation that followed took months, not days, and I'm not going to pretend it resolved as cleanly as a story should. There was no dramatic courtroom confession, No single moment where everything snapped into perfect focus the way it does at the end of a film. What there was, eventually, was enough. Sophie's phone records from that night, finally subpoenaed 6 years too late, showing a call to Grant at 1 in the morning that lasted 4 minutes and ended abruptly, cut off mid-conversation. A witness from a neighboring campsite who remembered once actually asked the right question for the first time in 6 years, hearing a woman's voice near the water and a man's voice telling her to calm down, just calm down, over and over. It was enough to reopen what had been closed. It was not, in the end, enough to prove exactly what happened in the water itself. And I think that unresolved edge is the truest, hardest part of this whole story. Some suspense doesn't get a clean answer. Some of it just gets enough light shone on it that the people who survive can finally stop pretending the dark was empty. Ethan and I did get married, eventually, almost a year later than planned, in a small ceremony with a very different guest list than the one we'd originally written. A guest list with one name quietly missing from it forever. Carol was there. She stood exactly where a mother of the bride might have stood, even though she wasn't mine, because by then she had become something neither of us had a clean word for yet, something we never tried too hard to name. I still think, more than I probably should, about the version of that week where I never go to that coffee shop, where a stranger's hand never closes around my wrist, where I marry a man carrying a 6-year silence I never once find out about, standing across from a best man I would have handed a microphone to, toasting a marriage he had spent 6 years quietly making sure nobody ever properly investigated. I think about how the whole story started with one line on a piece of paper, a single name, Sophie. And I think about how every single thing that followed it, every phone call, every silence, every flinch, every unanswered question was really just the same question asked over and over in a different shape until finally, 3 days before I was supposed to say I do to the wrong kind of silence, somebody was finally brave enough to answer it completely.